do you want to address briefly, like what would the Democratic, like what are those proposals? What are the implications of them? I mean, my only read, I just want to put this into the mix, is something like, people forget that the root of stop and frisk in New York City, which, is a universally, or not universally, but broadly understood to be, racist policing tactic, which in fact was struck down by a court and even somewhat reformed by Mayor de Blasio. That has its roots in an anti-gun program. So, I think it's a very valid concern that people say, well, what is on tap? Does this just become another sort of, all of the racial and class dynamics we could put in, but even just more broadly, another area of responsibilization and putting on individuals, and not as an example on, the American gun cartel. I'm not interested in demonizing individual gun owners at all. I am very concerned about these companies.
That's right, and that's like so key, right? And this talk about, again, other like implicit logics, which are more than just neoliberalism, but like a certain type of double bind, where you hear people saying the common democratic response is these weapons of war, talking about AR-15s, do not belong on our streets.
Where do they belong?
Exactly. That becomes the question, right? And even Chuck Schumer, like, bless his heart, has previous years gone to bat for Remington, for assault rifle manufacturers in his districts, because they're all American companies that employ Americans for jobs. And, like, you can't have it both ways on these things, right? You can't simultaneously be like, these weapons are very, very bad and they should not be used against Americans, but also I love making them and please let me take money from manufacturers or from arms industry lobbyists. Like, you can't do both these things at once. So, like, that's why, like, again, like, chips will cash out differently in terms of how various debates play out, but the lack of clear voices being like, all these objects are bad, this entire situation is verkakta, the lack of that predisposes the discussion to go in certain directions. But that said, and I will say, too, like, I hear you on the question of racialized enforcement, and the answer to this is complicated. I struggle with it myself. I will flag first, though, that like this is a type of internal conversation that you and I are having and that a lot of Democrats will acknowledge, or like, ones who are good faith and savvy. You don't hear that same type of internal dialogue on the right where like, are we proposing something a little too hasty that might have adverse consequences? I mean, today on the day of the 50-year anniversary, we still,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course
like,
not. Yeah.
Just like it's very weird where it's like both the objections that are proffered to gun control or to even talking about gun control, like imagine them on any other issue. And like today, it's the 16th anniversary of our launching a war based on nothing that killed 1 million people, and people are, and we didn't like. People are being like, well, you shouldn't do anything about guns because there are a lot of innocent people that might be negatively affected by their inability to buy an AR-15. I'm like, there are 1 million dead Iraqis that we didn't question what would happen to them before we launched it. Like, there's a weird double bind we put ourselves in. But independently of that, vis-a-vis this question of like what we can do about this, my answer more and more is like, well, first the political stuff has to happen. There has to be people being like, this entire situation is wrong. Right, that like moral voice needs to be there. Getting into the specific stuff about policy, you're absolutely right. It has been totally the case that gun control legislation in the 20th century, from Reagan reacting against the Black Panthers to the assault weapons bill getting bundled with the crime bill omnibus under Clinton to the advent of stop and frisk, that it's always been there's always been an aspect of racialized enforcement. And so the question becomes for leftists is like, how much can we, maybe gun control isn't the right way to be talking about this. Maybe dealing with gun deaths is the way to be talking about it. Maybe dealing with the question of violence is the way to talk about it. So the question then becomes very granularly, what are things that we can do that will actually lower the number of gun deaths that don't also give ground and empower the carceral policing state, right? And to their credit, a lot of these kids in Parkland are like, well, we don't want school resources officers. Like, they don't want to feed the pipeline either. And that's very heartening to hear.
Yep. I mean, maybe elaborate on that sort of hopeful note, because I think that, with the Parkland students, I mean, it's striking the way these students have emerged on a number of levels. And we don't, we'll figure it out. And, they're obviously super young, really savvy. Maybe they say some things that I disagree with from time to time, but that's totally secondary to, first of all, the fact that they're taking power into their own hands and doing solidarity, just like you were pointing out in the beginning. They're de-responsibility. Like, their very act of banding together as a rebuke of all this neoliberal garbage. And they're, you know, they have actually emerged from this story like, I know way more about them than I do about the shooter. You know, they're just objectively more interesting to hear from than the same, you know, horrible hack NRA propagandists or, you know, middling, you know, kind of Democratic whatever. They've got the actual charge and the vitality behind them. And they are making some of those distinctions you were pointing out. So, you know, maybe there is that hopeful note maybe there to leave us on.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think the kids are all right. You know what I mean? They're being amazing. And I don't want to put them on too much of a pedestal. I'm not saying you're doing that, but I want to be clear. Like, what they are asking for and what they need is solidarity rather than like deference, right? Right. They need people to go to bat from all these different ways. But like in terms of things that we can do concretely, first off, I think like it's important to remember that the problem of gun violence is not the same thing. The problem of mass shootings is only a subset of the broader problem of gun violence. And there's a way in which a lot of the conversation about mass shootings specifically becomes a way of avoiding talking about gun violence more broadly, right? Where there's an implicit thing where we just want to keep the violence in the urban hyper ghettos where it belongs implicitly. We have to reject that. So like the answer is to look at the problem of gun violence in terms of it actually being a problem that affects different groups in different ways, and then doing targeted interventions that deal with all those individual groups. So specifically, there are a lot of community activism programs that have been proven to do what's called violence interruption against urban gang violence. That works, and it doesn't necessarily involve the police. That's great, right? In vis-a-vis suicide, there have been a lot of unlikely movements, oftentimes within red states and even among gun shop owners, to attempt informally and otherwise to stop people who appear to be ready to kill themselves from buying guns, or at least, you know, can I hold this for you for several days? That also appears to have a real value at working, right? And then at the same token, too, talking about like what are the drivers of violence and acting out, to try to basically have points of intervention that deal with the misery of life that impels people to go ahead and become murderous rampagers, but to stop that earlier, to make them value their own lives more, to make them feel that they have a sense of possibility, to make them feel heard, right? And the trick is to do that through investment, to do that through giving people opportunities that are not just these sort of like sham neoliberal opportunities, but actually treat people like they're something other than just a number on a balance sheet. So like there's a whole suite of different policy interventions we can do, but the real thing is just to understand that this problem keeps on happening. It's not reducible just to the mass shootings that get headlines, and to have basically an intersectionally conscious awareness of the different people whose lives are affected by it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I just want to amplify I want to connect one thing and amplify one thing. Yeah, I mean, I've actually talked, you know, to a couple of people more like in that gun world, including a gun shop owner. And I'm not doing a reverse idealization of anybody. I mean, they're like all businesses and like all interest groups, there's plenty of irresponsibility and lack of care. That's obvious. But in contrast to some of the lazy assumptions we get into, I mean, some of those people, especially with specific kinds of interventions, are far more conscious and serious about it on a ground level than a lot of the higher level conversations that sort of take place in some of the kind of easy categorization, which I think we need to get away from on a cultural level, not on an industry level. I think those are separate things. And secondly, like, I mean, we could expand the conversation. I mean, it implies there inside the United States, the way gun violence plays out in terms of different incomes and different neighborhoods and racial disparities. There's also a global small arms market, which the United States and China, I mean, when we talk about what fuels so many conflicts and causes so many mass casualties internationally, a lot of it actually comes from, you know, again, there's the thought of like the big heavy artillery and underground arms traffickers, and all of that is real, but there's also just the day in and day out of, you know, money flowing to weapons flowing to everywhere from Mexico to Congo that these companies at the very least are recklessly, irresponsibly profiting from, and we're doing nothing about. So we could have a much, much broader, more aggressive full conversation and policy intervention and neoliberal intervention on all of it.
Yeah, this is the answer is to come up with some. You're absolutely right. Like small arms kill many more people than do like bigger missiles and all the sexier hardware out there. Like there is a way in which like the answer has to be coming up with a very clear organizing moral principle that ties together all these different subsets of violence and all the different institutions that are implicated in them. And my friend Daniel Denver has written about this very persuasively, but the idea of just talking about disarmament, actually disarming across the board, right, demilitarizing our society, like, those are real goals. They may be utopian in some ways, but they're only utopian relative to a certain calculus of realism, which is imposed upon us by people who are either cynical or ignorant, right? And so having a simple principle, it's like, no one should be getting shot anywhere. These weapons of war shouldn't exist on our streets or on other people's streets or on factories off our streets. And that's having a simple unifying, just like we need a proactive peace movement. And it's all part of that broader puzzle, but I think there's a moral clarity in just insisting that this does not have to be this way. This particular nightmare we're living in does not have to take this shape. It doesn't have to have this body count, both within our borders and outside them. And we need to have solidarity, both to attend to the problem in all its subsets of forms, but just to have this basic principle that this violence should not be happening, period, to anyone.